When you think about in the NFL, those teams that are the epitome of either mediocre or just slightly better than mediocre, not bad enough to be terrible and get a marquee, potentially franchise changing pick in the draft, and most certainly not viable enough or legitimate enough to really be viewed as any type of championship contending team. You have those teams, and then you really wonder for those organizations, number one, is it really worth it to be in that type of position? Is that your ultimate end game? And number two, if it's not, do you really have the ability to rise above and get to that next level? And one of the teams that perfectly epitomizes that for me in the NFL right now are the Houston Texans. Another year under Bill O'Brien, another season where they finished 9-7, their second straight divisional title, second straight playoff appearance, second straight time they left early. Now, granted, this year they actually won a playoff game, but that was against an Oakland Raiders team that didn't have Derek Carr. So, quite honestly, frankly, how much does that really count? And it's funny because, on the one hand, you're looking at a team that has had a winning record the past 3 years after having the worst record in the National Football League in 2013. You would think you would sit there and look at their head coach, Bill O'Brien, and say he's doing a really good job. And not only should he be commended for that, he should be rewarded for that with potentially an additional few years on his contract, some type of form of extension. But when you look at the Houston Texans, you wonder if a guy like Bill O'Brien is only capable of getting his team to a 9-7 level, and that is it. Is he really the type of guy that can take your organization, your team to the next step? Is he the type of guy that can put your organization in the upper echelon, the upper pantheon of AFC teams? And I think that's a real, valid, legitimate question. Because what's interesting is yet again this year the Houston Texans had a top flight defense. You might argue an even more dominant defense in 2016. And mind you, that was without arguably the best defensive player in the National Football League in J.J. Watt. Just think about that. You lose arguably the best defensive player in the National Football League, arguably the most destructive force on the defensive side of the ball in the National Football League, and your defense, for all intents and purposes, really doesn't miss a step. If anything, it ended up being a little bit better, even with him out of the lineup. It's crazy, especially when you think about the fact that Bill O'Brien is an offensive type of guy. He's an offensive minded type of head coach. So, if anything, you would expect pattern to kind of follow through where the offense would be really, really good and the defense would be doo doo. But for the Texans, it's the exact opposite. They have potentially a championship contending, championship caliber defense and an offense that languishes quite a bit behind. A top flight defense, even without J.J. Watt. You get great years out of Whitney Merciless. You had Jadeveon Clowney. They finally realized, ding dong, dumb dicks, he's not a 3-4 edge rusher. Let's put his hand on the fucking ground and watch some magic happen. And that's exactly what it was. Coming off of a microfracture surgery on top of that. A guy that's had, it seems like, every freaking injury in the world over the past 2+ seasons. Clowney stayed relatively healthy. And when he was on the field, and they finally realized that he should be a defensive end, not an edge rusher, in a 3-4, big things started to happen. And you start to salivate potentially at the future thought of the Houston Texans defense having J.J. Watt on one side and Jadeveon Clowney on the other side. I mean, that's scary to think about, especially guys like Whitney Merciless playing at a very, very high level as well. A.J. Boye, the corner, really coming out of nowhere and having a monster season for this team. I thought Bernardrick McKinney played really well. They had some key performances from several different guys at all different levels of the defense, again, without the heart and soul of their organization, without the best defensive player in the National Football League. That's crazy. And offensively, they tried to address the offensive side of the ball. They brought in Lamar Miller in free agency. He went over 1,000 yards rushing. They spent a first-round pick on Will Fuller, a third-round pick on Braxton Miller to try and get some more weapons in that Texans offense. They gave Brock Osweiler a ton of money to come from the Denver Broncos with the hope being that even though he didn't have a lot of experience in his 4 years in the league, that learning from Peyton Manning, learning in Gary Kubiak's system was going to be beneficial and carry over to where you could plug him in and he'd be able to take you to some level of success offensively with this Houston Texans team. The thought being is that while Osweiler didn't look spectacular in the time that he did have in 2015, here's a guy coming off of being a part of the Super Bowl championship team, and he had his moments. He had some big spots where he played well. In particular, the New England overtime game is one that really cries out to you and said, you looked at that game and thought, hey, Brock Osweiler might not be a superstar, but he could potentially be a solid NFL quarterback. Potentially. But then the 2016 season happened, and Brock Osweiler was an unmitigated disaster. His mechanics are terrible, his field vision is awful, his decision-making atrocious. It's frankly a miracle that this team finished 9-7 with that handicap that was Brock Osweiler. Because think about it. You went from having guys like Brian Hoyer as your starter and having DeAndre Hopkins have a monster year to giving a guy $36 million guaranteed over the next 2 years of Brock Osweiler to come in and stink up the joint and get even less out of DeAndre Hopkins. That's crazy. And I think here comes the whole thing. We could analyze this and analyze that. You can sit there and keep on the positive and talk about how this is a team third straight year with a winning record, third straight year 9-7, second straight year winning the division. This year they actually made the playoffs and they won a playoff game, so in theory that's progress. That's all fine and good, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really fucking matter. And the answer is no. For some reason, this dumb dick organization, the Houston Texans, just has a complete and total allergy to trying to draft and develop a quarterback. Now, granted, I understand 2002, new expansion franchise, your first ever draft pick was David Carr. You felt like you had to take the quarterback. You passed on Julius Peppers. You weren't the only team that missed on quarterback in that draft. The Detroit Lions took Joey Harrington. The Washington Redskins, late in the first round, took Patrick Ramsey. But it happens. Just because you missed on one quarterback doesn't mean that you necessarily would miss on the next. And that was an entirely different regime, entirely different decision-making and thought process going behind it. But at the end of the day, for some reason, the Houston Texans, whether it be Matt Schaub or the Brian Hoyer and Brian Mallett combinations of the world, or now Brock Osweiler, has this complete and total opposition to drafting a young quarterback early and developing him. Even though that's what the majority of playoff teams in the National Football League do year in and year out, is they have drafted and now developed their quarterbacks, and that's what the majority of Super Bowl teams and Super Bowl championship teams do, is they draft and develop their quarterback. So unless the Houston Texans know something that we don't, they don't. Because they keep making the same fucking mistakes at the quarterback position, and they expect the results to be anything different. How ridiculous would it be to waste all of this talent on defense, a J.J. Watt, a Jadeveon Clowney, a Whitney Merciless, a Bernardrick McKinney, an A.J. Boye, and others, by continuing to go with journeymen and taking gambles on guys that are basically 26-year-old rookies in terms of their lack of NFL experience. It's just mind-blowing. So you could talk about this or that and everything else, but until these knuckleheads draft a quarterback high in the first 3 rounds, preferably in the first round, and they develop that guy, it's never going to matter. Period. And if you think for a second that I'm going to be wrong on this, let me put it to you this way. You don't have a Drew Brees type of quarterback available in free agency. You don't have a Peyton Manning type of quarterback available in free agency. And anybody that has that dude is not really going to be willing to trade that dude. And if they did, they would command such a price in return that it would become cost prohibitive in order to make that deal. This team has to get out of this stupid mindset of we're going to get this veteran or we're going to bring in this guy and we'll sign him in free agency and da-da-da-da-da. It's ridiculous from a recent historical trend standpoint in the NFL, but it's also ridiculous from a salary cap standpoint in the NFL. Would I rather have a Brock Osweiler at 26 years of age basically being, for all intents and purposes, an NFL rookie in terms of live game experience? Or would I have rather just in 2016 taken Paxton Lynch in the first round? 22-year-old kid, raw as shit, not ready. But frankly, when you watch Brock Osweiler this year, what the fuck was the difference? And Paxton Lynch is several years younger, more athletic. Oh, and by the way, would be a whole hell of a lot cheaper in the grand scheme of things in terms of your salary cap. I just don't get it. I don't get it. Because you look at this Houston Texans team, they have the defense to win a championship right now. If you had any type of consistency on offense, if you had any type of ability to consistently move the ball and score some goddamn points, this is a Texans team that in theory is not that far away from being a Super Bowl contender and a team that could win the Super Bowl. But because of their stupidity when it comes to the quarterback position and being terrified to draft one in the first round, which they haven't done since 2002, all of those years, all those quarterbacks, and you passed on all of them early. Well, you're going to pin your hopes on Tom Savage? Give me a fucking break, okay? Give me a fucking break. And at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. We could talk about draft needs. You know, obviously, quarterback is not the only need. You know, they definitely need some help at offensive tackle with Dwayne Brown being old and their other offensive tackle being injured. They could use some youth and depth there and address that position early. They need to stop going with the ham and eggers like the Fedorowitzes, even though I thought he played a little bit better as the season went along, the Ryan Griffins, the Steven Anderson. They need a real deal tight end. And this is where you get to the frustration of Bill O'Brien. For what is seemingly all the good things that he does, there are just certain positions that he's a complete and total fucking moron on. Tight end is one of them, quarterback is another one. Those are two pretty damn important positions in the offensive scheme of things. And I think in their linebacking core, they could use some help too. I think they could use another edge rusher now that they're playing Clowney as a 3-4 end full-time, which is where the fuck he should have been the whole damn time. They could use another edge rusher opposite Whitney Merciless. I think they could use a young inside linebacker to groom to get ready to take over for Cushing very soon. They've got over $20 million in salary cap space. They need to get a long-term extension done with DeAndre Hopkins. Now Jadeveon Clowney's 3 years in. You could potentially look at extending him. You might put that on the back burner for another year, just pick up his fifth-year option. You could also say you could do the same thing with DeAndre Hopkins if you're having him play under the fifth-year option. A.J. Boye is a free agent. Are you really going to plunk down and give him number one corner money for one good season? Yeah. But again, in the grand scheme of things, it does not fucking matter. Because if this team does not draft and develop a quarterback, it's all for naught. Who gives a shit? All you were going to do is sit there and be middle of the road for the next several years, always thinking that you're a lot closer than you fucking actually are. You will be a less talented version of the Kansas City Chiefs. Ask the Kansas City Chiefs how that works. They got a pretty balanced roster. They've got talent all over the place. But at the end of the day, they've got a game manager in Alex Smith, who it's nice if the game is close, but he doesn't have the zip in his arm to stretch defenses vertically, and he just doesn't have that big playability. And at some point in time, you need that, and he does not have it. And that is why year after year, the Kansas City Chiefs are a contending team in one sense. They make the playoffs, but they're never really a threat to go anywhere. Because frankly, if it's a high-scoring game, they don't have the firepower to catch up and keep up and win. And in the playoffs, if the game is close, they don't have the big play potential in the passing game that they need to be able to win those games. And that showed again against Pittsburgh in the divisional round. It shows every fucking year. So you continue to stay down that path if you want. But it's not going to lead to a fucking Lombardi trophy. It's not going to lead to a Super Bowl ring. You can talk all this other shit about the Texans, but until they get that quarterback, and Osweiler ain't in it, it doesn't matter. Whether it is Trubisky, Mahomes, Kaiser, Watson, whoever the fuck it is, that's who the fuck the Houston Texans should be taking with the 25th pick in the 2017 NFL Draft. If they do, this team could win a Super Bowl by 2018. And if they don't, they will continue to be what they have been, a slightly better than mediocre team that nobody really takes all that seriously when it really matters.